At 30, the tragedy of Gianluca Ginoble is truly heartbreaking. And what makes it even more painful is how quietly it unfolded behind the glow of stages, applause, and the illusion of perfection. Because while the world saw a young man soaring to success, very few saw the silent storms he carried from childhood. He grew up in a small Italian town where his voice was both a blessing and a burden. A gift that set him apart, but also isolated him. Because while other children played without worry, Gianluca spent long evenings practicing, pushing himself, trying to become the version of himself everyone believed he could be. When fame finally found him, it swept him into a life he wasn't ready for. A life of constant travel, constant expectations, constant pressure to shine even on the days he felt dim inside. People adored his confidence, his charm, his presence. But behind closed doors, he struggled with loneliness that no applause could drown out. He questioned who he was beyond the spotlight, wondered whether people loved him or just the idea of him, and he carried a fear of letting anyone down, even when it meant letting himself break in silence. As he climbed into his 30s, the weight became heavier. A personal betrayal shook him at his core, the kind that makes a person rethink everything: trust, love, purpose. He lost someone he thought would be in his life forever, and the emptiness that followed was something he never allowed the public to see. Instead, he smiled, performed, and carried the world on his shoulders while his own world was quietly falling apart. The tragedy of Gianluca's story isn't in a headline or a dramatic public moment. It's in the quiet nights where he sat alone, trying to understand how a man so admired could feel so unseen. It's in the relationships strained by distance, in the dreams he sacrificed for the stage, in the moments he needed help but didn't know how to ask. Yet even through heartbreak, Gianluca kept going, showing a resilience that makes his story both inspiring and deeply sad. Because the truth is, behind every flawless performance was a man fighting invisible battles. Behind every interview was a heart trying to heal. And behind every smile was a reminder that even the brightest stars can burn out inside. His journey teaches us that fame doesn't protect anyone from pain. That strength sometimes looks like simply surviving. And that the people who seem to have everything can still feel unbearably alone. And maybe the real lesson in Gianluca Ginoble's tragedy is this: that every human being, no matter how gifted, beloved, or extraordinary, carries a story the world never sees. A story filled with hope, struggle, heartbreak, and the silent wish to be understood. When the world believed Gianluca Ginoble was living the dream, he was actually standing at the edge of the hardest chapter of his life. A chapter built from years of silent sacrifice and emotional wounds he never had the courage to voice. The truth is, the pressure he carried didn't suddenly appear. It grew slowly, year after year, hidden behind photos, performances, and the image of a man who seemed endlessly strong. What people never realized was how deeply he longed for a normal life, for days where he wasn't expected to be perfect, where he wasn't defined by his voice or the persona built around him. Every time he returned home, he found pieces of himself missing, relationships he couldn't maintain, moments he missed, and memories that slipped away while he was somewhere on another stage, pretending everything was fine. The tragedy deepened when he finally tried to open up, hoping someone would understand the heaviness he felt. But instead, he discovered how fame changes people around you, How some listen only to respond, not to care. How some stay close only when you shine, not when you break. And when the betrayal hit, the one that cut deeper than any criticism, he realized that even the people he trusted most could slip away without warning. The heartbreak left scars he hid from the world, scars that shaped his early 30s into a quiet battlefield. He would lie awake at night, replaying memories, questioning how things unraveled so quickly, wondering how a man with so much success could feel so empty. But what made his tragedy even more painful was his refusal to collapse publicly. He carried his pain with dignity, performing with the same passion, offering joy to millions while struggling to find joy for himself. And in those moments, when the music stopped and the applause faded, he faced the truth that had haunted him for years. Being loved by the world means nothing if you can't feel loved when you're alone. His strength didn't come from fame. It came from learning to stand back up when no one knew he had fallen. It came from quietly rebuilding himself, piece by fragile piece, even when he felt unworthy, even when the loneliness felt endless. And that is the second half of his heartbreaking journey, the part the world never saw, the part that proves that even the brightest souls can walk through darkness, and even the strongest hearts can break long before anyone notices. When the world still saw Gianluca Ginoble as the confident, polished star he had always appeared to be, the truth was that he was entering a chapter of life darker and heavier than anything he had ever faced before. A chapter that would quietly reshape him in ways even those closest to him didn't fully understand. What made this part of his story so heartbreaking wasn't just the pain itself, but how silently it spread through his life. Slowly, quietly, in the spaces between tours, in the late-night hours when the world was asleep and he was left alone with thoughts he had tried to outrun for years. He had spent so long building himself into someone strong, dependable, successful, someone who never cracked under pressure, that he no longer knew how to admit when he was hurting. And so, the loneliness that haunted him didn't burst in one dramatic moment. It grew like a shadow, stretching into every corner of his life. He had friends, but deep down he wondered how many truly cared for him and not for the fame attached to his name. He had admirers everywhere, yet he felt strangely disconnected from the world, like he was living behind glass, watching life happen to other people while he performed the same version of himself over and over. The pain grew heavier when he began losing people he thought would stay. Relationships that faded because he was always on the road, promises that broke because he simply couldn't be in two places at once. And the one betrayal that changed everything, the one disappointment that cut deeper than any headline, made him realize how fragile trust truly is. It shattered a part of him he didn't know how to rebuild. He would wake up with the weight of it pressing on his chest, wondering if he had given too much of himself to a life that never gave enough back. Yet he kept going, performing with that unmistakable voice, smiling for fans who adored him, never letting them see how much he was struggling inside. That is what made his tragedy so human, his insistence on carrying everything alone. He didn't want pity. He didn't want to be seen as weak. He wanted to protect the image of strength people believed in, even when he no longer believed in himself. The world never saw the nights when he sat in silence, staring at old photos of happier times, wondering where the boy he once was had gone. They never saw how much he missed the simplicity of life before the spotlight, how he longed to walk through a street without being recognized, how he wished he could just be Gianluca, not the idol, not the voice, not the star, just a man trying to find peace. And in the deepest part of his heartbreak, he realized something painful. He had spent so many years giving his life to music that he had forgotten to give enough of it to himself. The second part of his tragedy wasn't about a single event. It was about the quiet unraveling of a man who had been strong for too long. A man who had carried expectations heavier than anyone knew. A man who kept showing up for the world while quietly breaking inside. But even in this darkness, there was a kind of strength in him that refused to disappear. He kept searching for purpose, for healing, for connection, for a reason to keep believing that better days were possible. And maybe that's what makes his story not just heartbreaking, but deeply human. That even in his lowest moments, even when he felt completely alone, he still fought to rise, to grow, to rediscover himself, proving that sometimes the greatest battle a person faces is the one no one else ever sees. Gianluca Ginoble entered a chapter of life far heavier than the world ever imagined, a chapter marked not by loud tragedy, but by the quiet, suffocating kind that settles deep in the heart. As success grew, so did the loneliness behind it, stretching into late nights, where he questioned everything he had built. He had given so much of himself to his career that he barely recognized the man staring back at him in the mirror. Relationships slipped away, not out of lack of love, but because he was rarely present long enough to nurture them. And when betrayal struck, subtle, unexpected, and devastating, it shook him in a way applause could never heal. He felt surrounded by people, yet completely alone, trapped between who he was expected to be and who he actually was. He carried his pain quietly, performing with grace while breaking in silence, refusing to let the world see the cracks. The tragedy of this chapter wasn't one dramatic moment, but the slow unraveling of a man who had been strong for too long. Still, even in the darkness, he searched for himself, for healing, for a way to rebuild the pieces fame had slowly taken from him. Subscribe now to follow every chapter on this channel.